and welcome to this Women in Science event, the second in a three-part series co-produced by Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology News, or GEN, and the Rosalind Franklin Society. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Juliana Lemure, science writer at GEN, and I'll be your host. It's a pleasure and an honor to have Dr. Amy Abernathy, the President of Clinical Studies Platforms at Verily, here today. We'll have a chance to talk to Amy about her career path, her experience working at FDA, where the future of clinical trials and real-world evidence studies are headed, and her new role at Verily. Before we get started, I'll pass it over to the Executive Director of the Rosalind Franklin Society, Carla Shepard-Rubinger, who will tell us a little more about RFS. Carla, over to you.
Thanks, Juliana. The Rosalind Franklin Society is again so pleased to be hosting this Women in Science series with our colleagues at GEN. The mission of the Society is to showcase and promote the careers of women scientists worldwide. Many, like Rosalind Franklin, work tirelessly without recognition, but with an uncommon passion and commitment for their work. Dr. Franklin's now famous photograph 51 was the cornerstone of the discovery of DNA, but was given little recognition during her lifetime. Our speaker today has in fact received important visibility and is a model of creating a career across sectors. We are excited to hear more about her path, her new work at Verily, and followed by an interview with Juliana and me, and of course, time for some audience questions as well. Thanks so much for joining us, and back to you, Juliana.
Thanks, Carla. Yes, I want to mention that we welcome your questions for Amy. So please just drop them into the Q&A of the Zoom, not the chat, and we will try to take as many as we can. So some career paths take a winding road, and there are few people that know that better than Amy. She's held roles in academia, industry, and the government. Amy is currently, as I said, the President of Clinical Studies Platforms at Verily, an alphabet company founded on the convergence of healthcare, data science, and technology, building integrated solutions to improve health. Before joining Verily in July, Amy was hired by former FDA Chief Scott Gottlieb to be the Principal Deputy Commissioner and Acting Chief Information Officer of FDA. During her tenure there, she initiated multiple critical efforts, including FDA's Technology and Data Modernization Action Plans, and FDA's efforts to leverage real-world data and evidence to address critical questions during the COVID-19 pandemic. Before her time at FDA, Amy was Chief Medical Officer and Chief Scientific Officer at Flatiron Health. And prior to that, she was professor at Duke. We're excited to hear about her journey, lessons she's learned along the way, and her plans for the future. Amy, I'll turn it over to you now.
Terrific. What an honor to be here with you today. And an honor to be here with you today under the marquee of Rosalind Franklin. I think she reminds us how important it is that we all bring our best selves to science, no matter what's going on, and that the work that we do makes a difference every day. I'm delighted to talk a little bit about my life and the way I've thought about the problems sitting in front of me, and even more excited about the conversation we're going to have afterward, including questions both from Juliana and then also from our audience. So thank you for joining us today. Before we go to the question, I thought I would spend a little time hitting on 4 key points. First, I'll tell you a little bit about what's the problem I've been trying to solve and how have I been going out about trying to solve it across my career. Then I'll talk to you a little bit about my experience at FDA, because I think a lot of people are often curious about what it was like to work at FDA. I'll talk about what I see as the future of clinical trials and real-world evidence, and then finally about my role at Verily and why I took this role at Verily. So let's go back a little bit. I went to the University of Pennsylvania as an undergrad and then ultimately went to medical school at Duke University in North Carolina. I arrived in North Carolina in 1990 and became an oncologist as part of my clinical career. And when I was in the oncology clinic, I was actually in a clinical office, like, my space where I saw patients. And it was about 8 feet from the other side where was the lab that I worked in. And it made me really, it was just pained me that the work that we were doing in the lab oftentimes was going to take 10 to 20 years to make it into some type of intervention that was going to improve the lives of people with cancer. Later in my career as an oncologist, you can kind of see this story play out. So circa 2008, 2009, I was in the oncology clinic as a melanoma doctor. And at that time, if you had a 3C melanoma, the chance of death at 5 years was 50%. Yet on the other side of the wall, 8 feet away, we were studying treatments such as BRAF inhibitors and new ways of harnessing the immune system to treat people with melanoma. And really the why that has motivated me all of this time is that story from the cancer clinic. How do I find a way to take better care of the person in front of me as quickly as possible? And how do we speed up the process of understanding what's going to work for whom and when in a safe and effective way? When I was a young faculty member, one of the things that became really clear to me was that just in the overall delivery of care, we would ultimately basically be able to map the journey of a patient, both through the stories that we would tell, the information we would collect in the medical records, and the data points that would be collected in the laboratory or through radiology findings in other ways. But that mapping that happened through the narrative and through data points in the medical record actually didn't map to our ability to take better care of patients quickly. In fact, when we did clinical research, we did so completely separately. What happened in the clinic and the mapping in the electronic health record did not transfer over to the building of a clinical data set for a clinical trial. And so ultimately, as a young faculty member, I decided to do a PhD in informatics. And the focus of my PhD was really asking the question, how could we organize data, and specifically clinical data like electronic health record data or patient reported information like symptoms and quality of life, in order to be much more efficient in using that information to populate the clinical trial data set or other data sets that we could use to understand how do medical products work. That led in about 2005, 2006, to developing a program at Duke that we called the Cancer Care Research Program. We were asking the question, how do we use the information in the delivery of care to do better research? And then ultimately, we moved beyond just cancer to asking, how do we do this in aging and in gut diseases, et cetera. And we built out something called the Duke Center for Learning Healthcare. And what we realized in the Duke Center for Learning Healthcare is we could use better technology systems, software, better data systems to organize the data across a complete health system like Duke. We could use data warehousing and statistics, et cetera. We were locked by the boundaries of geography. So I was a full professor, a professor of medicine, kind of at that point, in a lot of ways, it seems like I should have slowed down, but I was still trying to figure out, how do we get better at figuring out what works for whom and when, and shortening that time to understanding treatments in the lab and how they work for real patients. And so my question became, could we motivate the health tech industry, Silicon Valley? What about venture capital to try and solve this problem? And so circa 2014, I hopped out of my seat at Duke and joined a health tech company in New York City. I was employee number 30, and this company was called Flatiron Health. And the whole idea was to ultimately leverage a cancer-focused electronic health record, which was being used by about 30% of cancer doctors across America, and clean up the data in that electronic health record so doctors could do a better job, but also then we could leverage those data sets to do clinical research. Interestingly, during that time, in order to move the work forward, I also worked on the 21st Century Cures legislation here in the United States. And I spent time in Washington trying to understand both what would motivate the American public and Congress towards figuring out how to do new research using these new types of data systems. And then how do we help FDA have the tools and capabilities that they would need in order to essentially establish the rules for what does good look like with respect to novel clinical trials and use of real world data for many different ways of understanding the performance of medical products. Now, the Flatiron Health story, many of you might know, ultimately Flatiron as a health tech startup was acquired by Roche in 2018. And suddenly I found myself in a place asking the question, what's the next step in moving this story forward for how do we leverage data and technology to speed up the process of understanding what works for whom and when. By that time, the 21st Century Cures Act had been passed and FDA was working on writing the guidances, the rules of the road for how to leverage real world data and real world evidence and how to think about using new clinical trial designs. And so when Scott Gottlieb asked me in the end of 2018 to consider taking the role as Principal Deputy Commissioner at FDA, I thought this makes perfect sense. It's the next part of the story. It didn't really dawn on me that indeed it was a completely different career turn yet again, but that was indeed what happened. And so at the end of 2018, going into 2019, I left my role at Flatiron to join FDA as the Principal Deputy Commissioner. The Principal Deputy is the highest career role at FDA and complements the political role that the commissioner holds. And I said at the end of 2018 in Stat News that the reason I was going to FDA was to work on three things. I wanted to work on personalized medicine, real world data, and patient centricity. You can kind of see from my story, it was the same real cause now playing out at the place of a government agency. But what happens when I get there? So I arrive at FDA in February of 2019, and I realized, wait a second, if we're going to push forward with accelerating the process of evidence generation through novel tools like data and technology, if we're going to keep moving forward with more and more personalized therapies like what's coming out of our laboratories for my patients with melanoma, in fact, the work at the FDA is going to have to scale as well. And the FDA is going to have new ways of receiving the data sets that we're generating. The FDA is going to have to be able to do more work with the same amount of people. And so I took on the role at that time of the CIO, the Chief Information Officer. I was acting CIO at FDA starting in April 2019, paired with my role as Principal Deputy Commissioner. And why did I do that? Because it was clear that the role of data technology in a regulatory agency needed to become a strategic role responsible for helping to grow a regulatory apparatus of the future that could receive the kind of data sets that we might be generating in the future with evidence generation. And that the FDA could, if we set it up in the right way, leverage data and technology to be able to do its work faster and smarter. And so at FDA, I instigated the Technology Modernization Action Plan, the Data Modernization Action Plan. We went to Congress and reorganized how the technical apparatus of the agency reports so that it was a strategic function and able to do work more quickly. We made sure we had the right kind of budgets. And one of the big things that I worked on at FDA, in addition to sort of the day-to-day management of the agency, was moving the agency forward with respect to its technical prowess and capabilities to act in this world of the future where data and technology would move things forward. Now, you probably are sort of noticing that I said I joined FDA in April of 2019. The Technology Modernization Action Plan, it's really interesting. When I think about it, we put that action plan in place in September of 2019, thinking that the premier use case was EVALI. Remember vaping-related lung illness? In September of 2019, that was the big conversation, and the need to understand EVALI quickly, understand why kids were suffering from this was really one of the key examples at that moment in time. But you can imagine that September 2019 was rapidly followed by January 2020. And suddenly the technical interfaces that we had started to develop at FDA to solve for the surveillance questions of Verily suddenly became that much more important as we went into the pandemic. So now really, as I go into 2020, what I could see was indeed the data and technology focus that we had going into the pandemic was very important, and we needed to keep pushing that forward. And then I also needed to think about, on the scientific side, how do we start to prepare the agency to develop its capabilities to leverage real-world data and the new data set capabilities that we were planning for the future. And so within the context of the pandemic, I developed a set of programs to help the agency and the entire area of science in the United States leverage real-world evidence, called the Evidence Accelerator, which takes me kind of to the end of the story. We're advancing the data and technology work at the agency. We're working hard and fast in government to try and address the needs of the pandemic. And then importantly, we were thinking about how could we leverage data of all types to try and understand the contours of the pandemic, or the issues around mortality. Which treatments do we need to prioritize and study first, second, and third? How do we understand a treatment's impact in the context of a rapidly changing pandemic? And as that was going on, I saw something else. I saw that our laboratories and our discovery sciences were working on all cylinders. I mean, think about the development of vaccines and how quickly that happened as soon as we understood essentially the whole genome of the virus. I saw that we were scaling the regulatory apparatus. We had leveraged a number of different types of regulatory flexibilities in order to address the pandemic. And that part of the equation of more quickly getting treatments that work to patients was also starting to work well. But when I zoomed out and looked at the story, what I could see was that our discovery engines were working quickly. We were working on scaling the regulatory apparatus and figuring out how to get treatments to patients. But we conduct clinical trials, we design our studies pretty much the same way we did when I started medical school. So our clinical trial thinking is still circa 1990, 1995. And so one of the things that I realized at that moment in time was that I really needed to leave the agency to go and work on that problem next. And I therefore left the agency in April of this year. And I didn't have a job when I left. I had a hypothesis, the next big problem to work on in order to take care of the patient sitting in front of me was to work on how do we plan for evidence generation of the future? How do we now imagine a clinical evidence generation apparatus of the future that combines traditional clinical trials with the best data that we have within the context of the real world data space in order to get to a place where we have totality of the evidence and the ability to continuously evaluate medical products like the vaccines within the context of the pandemic continuously across time. That means that we have to think about leveraging data and technology in new ways. We've got to make sure that we don't lower the evidence standard, but instead make sure that the science in terms of study design, data analytics, and using data in new ways maintains our expectation of a reliable and best understanding of what works for whom and when, and that we actually have to make sure that the entire scientific community and regulatory community imagines what that looks like together. And so that's the job that I've come into at Verily. And I really didn't start looking for a job until I left the agency and said, here's my hypothesis of what I think needs to be done. And in fact, there was a good match for the President of Clinical Studies platforms at Verily to indeed build the clinical evidence generation solution of the future. And so that's my job now. So with that kind of is my story of how I got to where I am now. And I turn it back over to you, Carla and Juliana, to help me kind of explore some of these elements of my career, and then we'll take it to questions from the audience.
Thank you so much. What an amazing story. And I think it's so, to me, it's so courageous to just like see a problem in this space and just go tackle it. You're just going to take care of it. So I think that's really terrific. So I know we want to go back to FDA and we have a lot of questions about that, but just to focus on Verily for a little bit more time, can you just I know a lot of people have heard about Verily, but can you tell us, what is Verily? What's going on at Verily? What are they doing? And tell us a little bit more about where your role fits there.
Absolutely. And I've only been there for about 5 weeks, so I'm still learning a lot of the answers to those questions indeed. Verily is an alphabet company. So this means that it came from an alphabet parent, and Alphabet is also the parent company of Google, just to kind of put all these things into context. But it's an independent company that essentially leverages some of the key capabilities that you might think about within the Alphabet Google context, such as top-notch, or sort of, I call it engineering prowess. So top-notch engineering capabilities, cybersecurity, sort of best in breed within the context of that space. But the Alphabet context, the Verily context, is to pull that together with scientific understanding, the ability to build devices that generate then data sets that can be used to conduct clinical evidence generation, or can be used, for example, for remote patient monitoring as a part of better healthcare delivery programs. Other parts of Verily are intended to also bring in data management capabilities and the best of analytics, so that what you end up with is a aggregation of capabilities intended to do several things. First is to really focus on how do we develop new solutions for clinical research. And that has historically been called baseline within the context of Verily. So the baseline program started off as essentially a longitudinal registry program, a community of patients who would agree to participate in a longitudinal study to understand how health changes across time as documented through a number of different data types. And then that study, the baseline study, also served as a mechanism to start to understand what kind of software systems need to be built to be able to conduct such a longitudinal study in new ways. How do we build the data systems better? How do we build the analytic capabilities better? How do we bring the science and the clinical understanding together with the engineering and analytical understanding to be able then to essentially build best in breed as it relates to clinical evidence generation? And so that's really been the growth from the baseline element forward. The focus on evidence generation as one piece of Verily is matched to a focus on improving healthcare delivery. So there's a number of focuses foci within Verily focused on, for example, chronic disease management and maintaining best work practices to reduce the impact of COVID at work. And then that's also matched with a number of other programs that Verily focused on better development of devices, and specifically medical devices, for example, glucometers, et cetera. So that's kind of the way that Verily is set up. And I went to Verily recognizing that these elements had been built for baseline, specifically for evidence generation. And now I could leverage that together with the huge number of teams at Verily to now think about where do we go for the future.
Okay, got it. Thank you. So what are your plans for the clinical studies platforms business, and what are you hoping to accomplish or change?
Interesting. So my plans for the clinical studies platforms business is really in several stages. The first is that one of the key areas of focus right now in the clinical studies platforms business is specifically around essentially clinical trial software capabilities that allow study participants to be met wherever they are. Many times we call these decentralized clinical trials capabilities. So the ability to interface with patients and get consent through digital interfaces, the ability to collect data such as symptom data or information from a study watch directly from patients, as opposed to them needing to go to research sites. So Verily has already built a number of capabilities around virtual or decentralized clinical trials, and we will continue to build those out to ensure that research is as patient-centric as possible, because that is a key feature, as well as efficient as possible. The second thing is we're going to continue our focus on improving the use of all types of data in order to make research more efficient. Right now, you can imagine that the way clinical research typically happens is you have a study and a set of objectives, and then you generate a single data set. That single data set gets analyzed, and then there's one answer. And how do we actually think about organizing data differently so that it's more than just one single closed-in data set, but data sets that are merged together in new ways to be as efficient as possible, and also maybe answer more questions than just one. And then the third thing we'll start working on is how do we improve on study designs? How do we move from one-to-one study designs to study designs that ultimately, for example, have a traditional study design, a traditional clinical trial, and then append real-world data for longitudinal monitoring of patients across time, so the patients don't need interference with their daily life in long-term settings as we start to understand how medical products perform over the long term.
Okay, thank you so much. I think I'm going to pass it over to Carla to kind of go back and ask some questions about your time at FDA.
Absolutely.
I surely am impressed with where you've landed and what's ahead of you, but there's so much in your background and your critical work at the FDA that I and many of us have questions about. So I wanted to first ask, when you joined FDA after a long career as an oncologist and then working on the commercial side at Flatiron, what were some of the biggest learnings for you moving to government and to that role? Were there surprises for you?
Oh, interesting. So the first thing I will honestly say is I was surprised by the sheer scale and speed of government. There was, in my mind, always this, kind of like something around government pace that I assumed things would be slow and plodding. And in fact, government moves very, very fast. The reason why it looks slow from the outside is any one potential swim lane may be moving slowly, but there are so many things that government is doing simultaneously that they move very, very quickly in aggregate. So I would actually say that one of my surprises around government is the sheer scale and magnitude of impact. FDA is a science-based public health agency, and another element of government that I found fascinating and very inspiring is that people who work in government are incredibly mission driven. I think we're all mission driven in science and healthcare. And being in government, and especially a place like a science-based public health agency, people are there because they see the big why. And the people who work at FDA are incredibly smart. If you ever get a chance to have a government role, I highly recommend it. The other thing that I learned at government, which was my other big surprise, is what I have historically now started calling regulatory familiarity. You can imagine that being and working in government for a number of reasons, including the importance of limiting conflicts of interest, meaning that people who work in government often work almost behind a wall in a lot of ways. And so we have to find ways to build bridges to the people who work inside government agencies, but do so in safe ways so that people inside the agencies have the opportunity to develop an understanding of, a visibility to new capabilities that are emerging now or into the future. And my example about this in the evidence generation space is that as we have developed new capabilities in terms of generating new types of data sets that may have an important role in understanding how medical products perform into the future, if the regulators don't have a chance to see how those capabilities perform, to see them in action, then there's no way regulators can develop the rules of what is and is not possible and what good looks like. And so we have to build public-private partnerships and new kinds of bridges into government in order to keep moving things forward with the pace of change possible, especially as we think about software and data.
Related to that, the regulatory environment clearly is a critical one and a controversial one. Could you talk a little bit about the recent approval process with Biogen's Alzheimer's drug? Clearly that was controversial and complicated, and I'd love to get your perspective, as much of that you can share with us.
Interesting. So, I was not involved in that decision specifically. And importantly, for my role, I needed to stay out of such decisions in case I needed to adjudicate things at some time in the future, you can imagine. But, a couple of observations. One is that my expectation of FDA and what I saw when I was there is that people take decisions like this very seriously. So nothing is entered lightly, and there is a lot of very careful work that happens with many different voices going into such decision. You can expect that hard decisions mean that there are going to be differing points of view, and coming to the final decision means adjudicating internally across all those different points of view. And so the reason I bring that up is that my expectation of FDA and what I have seen when I was there is that hard, careful work is indeed how FDA gets its work done. And I would expect that that's what happened in the context of the Alzheimer's drug as well. Second thing I would say is that indeed we have had accelerated approval, breakthrough, and other pathways now since the beginning of the accelerated approval pathway during the time of the AIDS crisis. And these pathways, I'm saying this as an oncologist, right, have been critical to helping to move forward that movement of the best of what science has to offer and getting that to patients as quickly as possible. So that I think it is dangerous of us, this is Amy speaking, to dismiss those pathways as not in service of patients, because in fact, we've seen that happen in HIV, we've seen that happen in cancer. And when we have critical unmet serious illness like Alzheimer's, the question is, why wouldn't we want to figure out how to leverage the best of what regulatory pathways have to offer us? The third thing I would say is that now our core task as a community is really to continue to evaluate these treatments. And let's assume that the Biogen one is not the last one. Evaluate these treatments across time. And I submit to you, it goes back to my observation around clinical trials and clinical research when I was at FDA. I submit to you, we've got to get that right. And we need evidence generation mechanisms now post-approval that are going to allow us to understand how these drugs perform. And, we need to do so objectively. And the last thing I'll say is the FDA is not responsible for pricing and the financing side of reimbursement of medicine. And so that really is outside of their lens. And so getting frustrated with the FDA around that part doesn't make sense given how the laws are written.
Yes. Not your job. Were there skills that you found transferred from working as an oncologist to industry and government? And are there different muscles that are needed in each of these environments?
Well, so first of all, I think that the skills that I learned as an oncologist, so how do I communicate with patients about hard things? And the skills that I learned as a scientist, the scientific method, the ability to create a hypothesis, and also a understanding in my own head and my ability to communicate that to others as to my conviction, my belief, or the sort of level of belief that my hypothesis is correct, has been really important across all of these areas. And so I would say that I rely on those or fall back on those pretty frequently. You can kind of guess based on everything that I've said around data and technology that my skills as with a PhD in informatics have been handy, but I've tried not to let that overwhelm some of the kind of critical elements of communication scientific method. One of the things I would say is that what's the same across all of these is the need for flexibility and agility and to focus on leadership. Like, what does leadership look like? How do you want to show up? What's your why, and how do you communicate that to others? And how do you inspire others to be a part and keep moving? When I was at FDA and there was 18,000 people moving forward, I needed to think about how do I inspire 18,000 people, but also as CIO, I needed to figure out how do I inspire all of the tech team at FDA to work hard and get up every day. And that need to inspire looks a little bit different in terms of what you say, but is no less important no matter which team that you're leading. The topics are different. The legal requirements are different. But what I would say is that those sort of elements of leadership just don't change.
Interesting. With this incredible tech team that you had at the FDA is clearly credited with having made major strides in technology under your leadership in particular. How did you go about determining what needed to change and then making these changes in such a large and complex organization? 18,000 is a daunting number to most of us.
So, it's interesting. When I go back, it was really clear to me that figuring out how we advance evidence generation at the time, mostly through real world evidence, and now you can tell I'm thinking a lot about the clinical trial side, but that evidence generation piece and moving towards personalized medicine were the goals that I showed up with. And really, they were all in service of patient centricity. But it was very obvious to me that there was going to be no way for that to happen once I got to FDA, unless we actually started to change the scaffolding, right? Like we had to change how data could be transmitted to FDA and how FDA was going to use it. I would say, like, if I think about it, part of the way that I was able to kind of see what needed to be done was the value of having an extra set of eyes. I'd seen this now in a number of different organizations, big like Duke, small like Flatiron, but getting to FDA, I could kind of see it differently. And one of the things I realized is that I started off, when I first got to FDA, I wrote a white paper basically about this. I would say I probably did it like 4 or 5 months in, and people looked at me like I was nuts. I tried talking outside of FDA people about my white paper. I tried inside. Nobody, I was like, So when I realized I needed to just start showing people what it looked like rather than talking about it. And it's actually very similar now at Verily, or what we saw at Duke. And so being able to, have use cases, examples that people go, aha, now I get it, becomes really important to help people rally. And so I felt like not only was it important to have a really clear idea of what needed to happen, I needed some proof points for people to say, aha, I understand. But then ultimately, just like everything else in leadership, it's leading through people. And so being able to help people understand where we need to go and to paint the vision, that aspiration, now people who have incredible skills and know-how can actually start putting the pieces together to start pulling that off. And so whereas it might have been easy to basically write budget requests for faster computers and data lakes, instead, what I mostly focused on was culture, organizational change, communication, and the elements that help people do their work every day. And honestly, what I feel most proud about from my work at FDA was how people got excited about the problems to solve and kind of came to the table to solve it, not the size of the budgets we actually could ultimately maneuver to help people solve the problems that needed to. And so I would say that that's the other part of this. You have to, though, and this is something that's coming up at Verily right now, you have to actually push from both sides. You can't just stand kind of at the pulpit and tell everybody, here's what we're going to do. You actually have to roll up your sleeves and be a part of getting things done, so that then as you start moving things forward, everybody feels like they're rowing in the same direction. And so that's one of the things that we did a lot at FDA as well.
Well, speaking about the leadership and the importance of the pulpit, why do you think it's taking so long to find a new head of the FDA?
Oh, actually, so I very explicitly left FDA when I did, and I've said it vocally before, because I wanted to also be able to put my voice and weight behind Janet Woodcock, because I really do think she's a terrific leader, an absolute terrific leader for the FDA. I think there's a couple of reasons it's taken a long time. One reason is, at least in the beginning, I'll say January to April, May, frankly, FDA was one of the places with senior seasoned leadership that, there were a lot of other fires to fight for the administration, and that was one element. I think another element of it certainly has been that in the trading that happens in Washington, if you're trying to push forward the infrastructure bill, you can't kind of upset certain people who have different points of view on other things. And I suspect that's playing a lot out. at the end of the day, this is a science-based public health agency that's critical to the pandemic, and we got to get this moving forward. I don't know what's going to happen, but I do know it is absolutely critical that we have strong, stable leadership at the helm of the FDA, because it's very hard to take risks and do, the big things that need to get done until you sort of know this is my job, and the Congress knows that's what your job is. The one thing I'll say, thank God it's Janet Woodcock there right now, because she at least is able to have the conviction of, I know that this is what I need to do, and gets things done.
Right, and both her science and her longevity at the agency are critical.
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
very exciting. Well, I don't want to dwell on the past too much, so maybe we'll have Juliana focus on a little bit more on what you're doing with clinical trials and real world evidence, because that clearly is the important future you're going to be working with.
Yeah, sure. So what do you think needs to change in the way that we conduct clinical research to get medicines, devices to patients faster?
I think one of the big issues here is that we need to go from this concept of one question, one study, one answer, to being able to have a meta study that has multiple answers. So that is a critical shift in the way that we're going to need to think about how evidence is generated, because otherwise it not only does it take too long, but patients can't multiply participate in many different pieces of research. I think we also need to pair the narrow evidence that comes from a formalized clinical trial with sort of narrow eligibility criteria with much more inclusive evidence that comes from real world data, because otherwise what we do is we end up leaving out the real people where interventions are meant to touch. So we're going to need to start thinking about totality of the evidence in order to get to inclusive evidence. And then I think we got to get rid of the data lock mentality. Right now, the way that we think about things is we get to data lock, and then the data are finally cleaned, we get to an answer, and then that answer is thrown over the fence to FDA or whoever else is actually supposed to cross-check it. And we need to actually get far more seamless and dynamic in terms of how data sets and answers then get passed over to the other people who need to adjudicate and cross-check in a continuous way. And that's going to require us to think a bit differently. Our data lock mentality comes from the way our systems worked in 1995, and we just have far better technology that we can leverage these days to solve for that.
Okay, great. And how can we drive greater patient participation in clinical trials? I guess it's funny because, I know people who are desperately trying to get their children in the COVID vaccine clinical trials and actually can't get in them. But I guess normally that's not the problem, right? That everybody wants to get in. So given that, how can we get more patients in clinical trials?
A good friend of mine just had all three of her children in the COVID trials. I think that I've had this kind of concept in my head of what I call a recruitment product manager, like a person whose job it is to think about all of the ways that we interface with real people to help them know about clinical research, potentially participate in formalized trials, and sort of be ready also to receive the output of information in the future. So we need to see, the idea of recruiting or interfacing with people in the clinical research landscape like any other hypothesis. We've got a series of potential ways that we might improve on this, and we need to develop the solutions and test them and figure out what works for what kind of problem and community. The second thing I would say is that I think we should also think about people who are already prepared to know about research and be able to potentially be involved in the future. I saw this as an oncologist, especially in the breast cancer community, where the advocacy community motivated people who have breast cancer or who have friends or family members of people with breast cancer to now be parts of large communities and registries, so that if there's an interesting study in the future, they can then be more quickly notified and participate. And I think we need to do that on a number of scales. The problem being, though, none of us is any one thing, right? And so we actually have to think about it not as recruiting breast cancer communities or recruiting communities of patients who have inflammatory bowel disease, but rather how might we be participants as people in multiple communities, or how might the communities come to us in some ways? And so I think we got to think differently about that. We also need to give people their information back, right? Like, it's not a one-way participation. And we also need to recognize that you shouldn't have to go to the clinic or hospital to participate, but you should have the opportunity to go to the clinic or the hospital to participate. Right now, we seem to have this bifurcated version of decentralized clinical trials or clinical trials at research sites, but we need to be able to blend that. What if you're in a decentralized clinical trial and you have a safety concern, or just you want to talk to your healthcare provider? Why can't you now go to a site? And so we actually need to sort of pull those things together. So it's more about what people need and not about the requirements of the system.
Got it. I mean, so would you say at the core, it sounds like maybe communication with patients slash people is really a huge kind of area to improve. Is that correct?
It's always an afterthought, in research, right? Like, the communication bits is either the newsletter or, by the way, can you remember to say this when you're a busy study coordinator to a patient as a part of all the different things that you're doing. And instead, actually, communication, just like leadership, and we're talking about all the different ways of moving things forward at FDA and other places, communication is fundamental to how we interact and do our work together. And so it has to be high on the priority list. It's not an afterthought.
Absolutely. Totally. Couldn't agree more. I actually want to go to an audience question. And so Ashish is wondering, what role can tech play in building registries and patient communities for rare diseases? And I mean, I follow the ultra rare disease community relatively closely, and I know FDA put out a guidance not long ago that the community advocacy groups were very excited about. So so how does all that work with something like rare diseases?
So, this was something that we were starting to explore when I was at Duke, and certainly I have been exploring now at this point through all of my lives, which is that how do we leverage software? How do we leverage better ways of pulling in data from multiple systems to solve for building the registries? My example that I used to work on at Duke is that, and I worked together with the gentleman who started the Chordoma Foundation, and he got his care partly in a state 600 miles away from where he was living. And one of the things that he often talked about was that the places that, as a rare disease patient, that you interface with are not connected electronically. Their data systems aren't connected, but yet we need to be able to build registries and methods of interacting with individual people in the rare disease community, as well as helping for the safe and secure longitudinal collection of information from many disparate places. And tech has a huge role to play in that. There's been a number of tech companies focused on this, as well as advocacy groups. And I think that the biggest thing to remember here is that it doesn't have to be any one solution. There needs to be something that allows for safe information, and that real people should have the opportunity to say yes or no. Like, we opt in and out of all kinds of things in our lives. And so if you are a person in the rare disease community and you're an enthusiastic yes, but then somebody doesn't use your information correctly across time, you should have the ability to say, this is not for me anymore, and pull back, because then that keeps all of us, responsible and honest as it relates to making sure that people's information is used in ways that are aligned with what they've given permission for in the future. And so I think there's a huge role for tech to play, but it's also a conversation we should be having as a society to make sure that we're doing these things in the right way.
Okay, terrific. Our hour is flying by, and I know that Carla has some questions about being a woman in science, so I think I'll pass it back over to her.
I would be remiss, having sponsored this with Rosalind Franklin Society, to not tap into a little bit of your experience. And just if you could think back on the challenges for you as a woman in science, both in your early career, your academic training, and now. Has being a woman been an asset, a liability, neither, both, different at different times?
Different at different times, to be honest, Carla. I think that my mom was a single mom who wrote a nursing textbook and who, had more fortitude than anybody that I've ever seen. And, she taught me a ton about just getting it done, about, hard things are hard, but worth doing. And so I would say that being a woman across time, sometimes I didn't have the mentors that would help me figure out how to navigate a situation. And I needed to figure out, how do I cobble together mentors that would be able to help me navigate the situation, but also do so gracefully as a woman. And I would say that there were times when I didn't have what I needed because I was a woman, like the mentoring situation, but that actually forced me to get smarter in figuring out how to solve the challenge. And in fact, in the mentoring arena, I would say that what that led to was then a larger group of mentors who in aggregate were definitely the reason that I was able to navigate so many different places. And their advice and ability to help me along the way was actually a byproduct in the beginning of not being able to find a mentor, and then having to come up with a creative solution of essentially a board of directors with multiple mentors to help me along the way. So I would say it's been hard as a woman, but it has also made me smarter and has given me fortitude. The other thing that I would say is that I've decided somewhere along the way to not worry about being a girl. And what I mean by that is I didn't try and hide it. I liked feminine things. I wanted to be a mother. I was perfectly happy and actually much happier being able to say, this is how I am, than actually trying to be something different. But it took a while to get comfortable with that, especially in medical school and early residency. And so I would say that my one sort of thing looking back is I wish I had realized that about myself earlier in terms of being a woman in science.
That's great advice. And I love the fact that clearly this has changed over time in your career. So related to this, what kind of advice would you give to burgeoning women in STEM and also to girls who are thinking about careers or not even yet careers, but at their role and interest in science?
So kind of aligned with what I mentioned before, my number one piece of advice is have mentors and recognize that you may need new mentors over time. It doesn't mean that you get rid of your old mentors, but instead you grow an enlarging board of advisors, because not only are they advisors that help you chart the path, they open doors for you. They pick you back up when hard things happen and you need to have, somebody cheering you on the sidelines to kind of get you up and going back forward. So mentors are very, very important. And they, I think as you get older in your career, it doesn't mean you don't need mentors anymore. It just might mean that they change a bit over time. The second thing I say to young women is get yourself into many different places where you have the chance to see and explore what something looks like, whether that is summer programs where you're in a lab, or the opportunity to be a part of conversation groups. But being able to see and get exposed to many different types of things will help you figure out what is exciting to you and how do you want to sort of chart the path. And the last thing I'd say is be willing to break the mold. I think one of the things about medicine, at least, in my career, is there was always, this is the way that you do it. You start off with an assistant professor, and then you're an associate professor, then you're a professor, and like, this is what it looks like. And I feel like nobody really in the beginning gave me permission to break the mold. And I wish I had known about that permission far earlier, because man, oh man, one of the ways to innovate and solve hard problems is actually to go off script.
Yeah, well, you clearly have done that. Just one final piece in terms of your particular role, looking at your incredible career with academic training at Penn, at Duke, at Flinders in Australia, and the significant leadership positions you've had in academia, in government, and in federal government, and in industry. What were the major challenges for you in each sector? Were they similar or different?
Interesting. I would say that the major challenges in each sector are actually fairly similar. I used to say be a weeble. And what I meant by that was that, like, you're going to get knocked over. You're going to do something that you thought was the right thing to do. And you've either, hurt somebody's feelings, went in the wrong direction, and it was the wrong thing. And you're like, oh my gosh. And, instead of wallowing in it, find a way to be a weeble, to pop back up, to smile, and develop the graciousness to sort of kind of keep moving forward. And so I would say that all of those different roles, I've had to really be able to get through whatever challenge it was by being a weeble. The other thing I would say is that through all of those different areas, we talked before about communication. I've learned about the importance of clearly communicating to each different group why I do what I do. It's very hard to imagine, why in the world are you showing up here when you're supposed to be over there? And if I can keep communicating my why, I'm showing up here because I'm trying to help solve this problem. It really helps people trust you. It also helps to make it easier to get into the path of what you do next. And so it kind of goes back to what Juliana was talking about with communication. Being able to do so in a transparent and humble and honest way actually really helps to move things forward.
So just lastly, a question based on what you were just saying. With your experience in each of these three sectors, this is clearly coming together in many ways in your new work at Verily Health. And how hard is that to do? Bring these sectors together now? I mean, clearly you're working together in these sectors.
It's really hard. And each one of them, one of the things I've learned is the importance of developing lingua franca, right? The same word doesn't mean the same things across disciplines. And so if you're going to do something like what Verily is trying to do, which is to bring together software and data and science and clinical medicine, and then business and legal and all these other things, then you ultimately have to figure out, how do you find the common language? You can do that first by having a common vision, but then if you get to the specificity, you need to actually develop the glossary. And I would say that's one of the things that's really made a huge difference across all those sectors, is developing a common vision and then a common glossary.
Common language, common communication. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, I don't want to take our last minute here. I think Juliana can help us close, but this is just such a tremendous amount of information and inspiration, and really thank you for this.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. We could talk about this all day, but we know that you're extremely busy and have other things going on. So I'll just say that this brings us to the end of our discussion and concludes part 2 of our Women in Science series. We want to again thank Amy and Carla for terrific discussion. I want to thank our team behind the scenes for making everything run so smoothly. And I want to thank all of you for joining us. Please join us again on October 1st for our last talk of this 3-part series. We'll be talking to Fiona Murray, the Associate Dean of Innovation and Inclusion at the MIT School of Management. She'll give a talk entitled The Generation and Commercialization of Innovation: Who is in the Room/Lab? And you'll be able to find today's event on demand on Jen's website. For everyone at Jen and the Rosalind Franklin Society, I'm Juliana Lemire. Stay safe, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amy.